The surprise Japanese attack on Hawaii's Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shook the United States to its very core. The country was suddenly gripped by a terrible sense of insecurity as it was pulled into the horrors of World War II. Most of the fighting thereafter, of course, was done overseas, but that's not to say American territory wasn't also under threat. Pearl Harbor had shown what the enemy could do, and the US knew it needed to defend itself. And in its hour of need, it turned to a group of people whose contributions to the war effort have been ignored for far too long. The forgotten Native American force that protected Alaska during World War II. In addition to Hawaii, there was another part of the country that was particularly vulnerable to attack: Alaska. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese embarked on another aerial assault of an American base. Their target this time was Dutch Harbor, which sat on Alaska's Aleutian Islands. The Japanese successfully managed to take two of the islands, Attu and Kiska. This was now a serious situation. No foreign force had managed to occupy American territory in more than a century. It's unclear what the rationale behind the invasion had been from the perspective of the Japanese. The vitally important Battle of Midway was raging at the time, so maybe attacking the Aleutians was a ploy to get the US to remove some of its ships from Midway and to send them to Alaska. Maybe they thought the Aleutians, under Japanese control, would act as a buffer, preventing the Americans from launching an invasion of Japan from there. We don't really know, but we do know the loss of the islands was hugely demoralizing to the Americans. That, in itself, was a powerful result. Japan didn't hold either Kiska or Attu for very long. The Americans did start to fight back, and they launched a campaign to recapture the islands. They managed to wrestle back control of Attu first, before retaking Kiska a few months after that. The reclamation of the islands was a great success in and of itself, but the benefits of the campaign extended further than its primary objective. It provided the Americans with experience of island-hopping battles, which would later prove essential throughout the Pacific War. Even though the Americans had managed to take back Attu and Kiska, the episode plainly illustrated the urgent need to secure Alaska's sizable borders. But for that to happen, the US needed to assemble a capable defensive force. And that was easier said than done. Those who did step forward to fill that need were, in large part, members of the Alaskan Indigenous community. From several villages across the territory, local people stepped forward and offered to lay their lives on the line for the good of the United States. Members of the Inupiaq, Yupik, Aleut, Athabaskan, Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian native communities all signed up to a newly established military reserve force known as the Alaska Territorial Guard, ATG. They weren't the only ones in the force, either. There were probably members of other indigenous Alaskan communities in the ATG, too, not to mention white Americans. The coming together of these people represented the first time that such an array of ethnic groups had ever worked under the same banner. Following its formation, the ATG came to be widely referred to as the Eskimo Scouts. It should be noted, though, that the usage of that particular term today is regarded as rather problematic. Most would advise avoiding it altogether. That's because a wide consensus among Alaskan Native communities exists that considers the term Eskimo to be unacceptable. The word was historically forced upon their communities by colonizers, and it is consequent. It's been documented that 6,300 plus indigenous Alaskans stepped up to volunteer with the ATG. There were both men and women among them, some young, some old. Apparently, the age profile of volunteers started an astoundingly youthful 12 and stretched as high as a frankly venerable 80. These people were equipped with a uniform, snowshoes, a rifle, and a manual in military training. They were drilled in the ways of army life, yet they weren't paid a single penny for their efforts. Without the volunteers, who knows what might have happened to Alaska or the United States in general. Alternative histories are a difficult thing to imagine, but if Alaska had fallen to the Japanese, things might well have played out differently than they did. The ATG was vital because its members knew Alaska better than anyone. They had knowledge about their homeland that couldn't be quickly learned, and that made them phenomenally effective in their defensive role. Most people in the pre-war period tended to overlook or misunderstand Alaska in a way its native inhabitants never have. An exception to that rule was William Seward, who served as the U.S. Secretary of State between 1861 and 1869. During his tenure, he oversaw the American purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire. He clearly foresaw how useful the territory might prove to be. Not many of Seward's contemporaries seem to have agreed with him. Several newspapers of the day referred to the Alaska Purchase as Seward's folly, and even some of his fellow government officials failed to grasp the area's importance. And after gold was found there, the U.S. still failed to set up sufficient defenses against invading forces. After the war, the U.S. perspective on Alaska's importance was markedly different to what it had previously been. We can see the change clearly by comparing statements from senior military officials from each era. In November 1937, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Malin Craig offered his thoughts on the territory. He remarked, "The mainland of Alaska is so remote from the strategic areas of the Pacific that it is difficult to conceive of circumstances in which air operations therefrom would contribute materially to the national defense." Now, let's compare that to the words of General James F. Hollingsworth of the United States Army Alaska. In February 1971, General Hollingsworth said, "As I continue to correspond and to talk with people throughout the United States and the Department of Defense, they too can see clearly the importance of these two battalions which you make up. The real honest-to-God and real-world first line of defense in Alaska nearer our opponent, Communist Russia, than any other armed troops in the United States." These two statements were made less than half a century apart, but their respective stances could scarcely be more opposed. As the U.S. started to prepare for its entry into World War II, the military decided to withdraw the National Guard from Alaska and send it down to Washington state. That meant the former territory was profoundly vulnerable should it ever be attacked. Alaska has just shy of 34,000 miles of shoreline. That's an awful lot of space to cover, and without the National Guard to do it, the area was starkly exposed. Locals had to step up to deal with the situation, but initially their efforts were extremely disorganized. American military officials had made a terrible mistake. They had believed Japan would basically have no motive to take Alaska, but they were wrong. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had a new target on American soil. 6 months later, they were bombing Dutch Harbor on Alaska's Amaknak Island. Japan also sent forces to take uninhabited islands off Alaska. Some of the crew even got off their ships, entered communities, and questioned the people who lived there. The U.S. had sleepwalked into a domestic crisis. It would eventually become clear just how important Alaska really was. For one thing, it was the only location in the entire Western Hemisphere where platinum could be found and extracted. Platinum was used in the production of weapons and engine parts, so naturally was vital for the war effort. Not only that, but Alaska was also perfectly positioned to allow supplies to be sent from the US into the Soviet Union. Remember, although later the two countries would become deeply suspicious of each other, they were allies at the time. There were some who were alert to the danger of letting Alaska fall to the Japanese. Alaska National Guard Major Marvin Muktik Marston, for one, was very concerned, especially after enemy aircraft had been spotted over one of Alaska's islands. He knew a unit needed to be assembled quickly to help protect the wider territory. It was Marston who led the effort to put together the ATG, a force of locals who knew their land and would be in the best position to defend it. He set off on a mission to recruit those willing to help. Marston was working under the direction of the territorial governor of Alaska at the time, Ernest Gruening. It was to Gruening that Marston had suggested the best course of action here would be to assemble a group of indigenous people to protect the territory. Both Gruening and Marston understood the stakes at play here. How could they not? The same month they started their recruitment drive was the same month that Japan took Adu and Kiska. Adu and Kiska just didn't seem that important at the time. They were volcanic, barren, and frequently exposed to extreme weather. Thick fog, intense gales, rain, and snowfall. The fact the Japanese would go to such an effort to take such places took some people by surprise. Yet the Japanese clearly had their reasons, in any case, and now the Americans needed to respond. This isolated part of the world had suddenly been thrust into the center of a great struggle between two major powers. Across America, the loss of the two Aleutian Islands was extremely disconcerting. What if, some wondered, this was just a first phase of a wider operation to invade mainland Alaska, or even parts of the United States itself? Alaska, remember, wasn't actually an American state yet. But in spite of concerns like this among civilians, military officials still seemed relatively unconcerned. War in Europe was on the horizon, and the aftermath of Pearl Harbor was still being worked through. Those things were the priority, though American forces did occasionally drop bomb salvos on the occupied islands. The Japanese, meanwhile, were getting to grips with the conditions that met them on Attu and Kiska. The weather was extreme, yes, but their navy ensured the soldiers posted on the islands were well equipped. They may have felt they were in a pretty good position. Slowly but surely, though, the US was beginning to put together plans to get its islands back. Thousands of troops were dispatched to the region, and they were stationed on other islands in the Aleutian archipelago. And on January 11, 1943, soldiers were sent to Amchitka Island, close to occupied Kiska. By March, a naval blockade had been imposed on Attu and Kiska by the Americans. That meant the Japanese couldn't get all the supplies they needed to sustain their occupation. On March 26 they tried to breach the blockade, but they were spotted by the Americans. The engagement that ensued became known as the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands. The Japanese fleet was actually greater in numbers than its American counterpart, and its ships consequently inflicted significant damage on the American forces. Yet a few hours into the battle, the Japanese suddenly pulled out. The Japanese, it turns out, didn't actually realize just how badly they damaged their American enemy's fleet. On top of that, they were afraid that American bombers might show up to help the ships on the water at any minute. They were in a position of tremendous strength without quite realizing it, and they blew their chance to take advantage. As a result of the Japanese fleet's failure, those soldiers occupying Attu and Kiska were now forced to live without sufficient supplies. The Americans could see that they were gaining the upper hand, so they readied themselves to strike. For many weeks the Americans bombarded Attu and Kiska, trying to weaken the Japanese defenses there. Then, on May 11, 1943, they launched Operation Landgrab, in which 11,000 soldiers landed on Attu. It was thought they'd be successful after only a few days, but that was naive. The operation took a fortnight, with conditions on the island making progress extremely difficult. The Americans hugely outnumbered the enemy numerically, but their troops suffered greatly from afflictions including frostbite and gangrene. Low food supplies made things worse, and that's to say nothing of the fighting itself, which was generally confined to minor-scale, very intense skirmishes. In addition, the Japanese had set lots of booby traps. The American foot soldiers struggled on Attu, but the US forces enjoyed a big advantage when it came to air and naval battles. In the end, that situation ultimately wore the Japanese down. The invaders eventually ran extremely short of both food and ordnance, and the American troops had them pinned down. The Japanese then launched one last desperate charge on May 29. This surprise Japanese tactic made gains in the initial stages, but it ultimately proved unsustainable, and their forces were defeated. Over the course of the next few days, the Americans took back the isle. Some 2,000 Japanese were dead by the end of the Battle of Attu. US losses numbered about 1,000 men. Kiska was next, but the Americans had learned a lot from the operation to take back Attu. For that previous effort, soldiers weren't properly supplied, so military planners were eager that such a situation didn't repeat itself. They expected to encounter more Japanese troops this time, so they were determined that their own soldiers would be equipped appropriately. In the end, though, hostilities didn't play out as expected. When 35,000 American troops landed on Kiska, they found that the Japanese had already left. They'd slipped away while it had been foggy, so the Americans hadn't noticed. The Battle of the Aleutian Islands and the Japanese occupation were over. The American victory in the Aleutians had significant knock-on effects. The Japanese came to fear that the US might launch an invasion of Japan from Alaska, so they pulled some of their men and sent them north to prevent any such assault. But that meant their forces in the Pacific were weakened now. The US wanted to keep it that way. So to ensure Japan remained fearful of an invasion from Alaska, they sent planes from the Aleutians to the Kuril Islands, which were under Japanese control. This is the context within which Major Marston was working. The importance of Alaska had suddenly become starkly clear, and it was his job to keep it secure, though he had limited means at his disposal. So, he began traveling around Alaska to recruit for the ATG. No small undertaking, Alaska is huge, barren, and cold. He had hundreds of miles to cover, and he did it in the time-honored fashion of any Alaskan worth their salt. He traveled via dog sled. Stopping off in myriad different villages, he ultimately assembled a multi-ethnic group of volunteers. The volunteers were trained in the ways of the military, which included learning how to pick out enemy ships and planes. But many of their existing skills were incredibly useful, too. Their knowledge of the land was essential when it came to protecting it. The ATG watched over the vital platinum mine, they looked out for the enemy, and moved essential supplies around the territory. It was all really important work, even if they weren't the sort of duties that make for great war movies. The ATG eventually came to be responsible for constructing buildings, bases, and airstrips, too. They were generally on call to assist the military in all sorts of ways, making repairs where necessary and setting up trails through the wilderness. They also became firefighters and rescue workers, whether that meant helping people on land or on sea. Their service was wide-ranging and vital, and remember, they didn't earn a penny for it. Of the thousands of people who joined the force, a mere 21 were ever compensated. The rest did what they could out of nothing more or less than a sense of duty to their homeland. While mostly unheralded, some noteworthy members of the ATG have had their stories told in the media in recent years. For example, there was Holger Harhae Jorgensen, who flew planes and was at one time a Morse code operator. David Ungrudrick Levitt Sr. spent his younger years as a hunter, living off whatever he managed to catch. He had been a teenager when he signed up with the ATG. Then there was a guy named Wesley Ujiktak, who had once herded reindeer and been captain of a whaling ship. The members of the force were all very different, coming from different tribes and backgrounds. But all of them brought unique expertise and experience. In 2017, the US Department of Defense actually sent someone to talk to a former ATG member for an article on its website. The piece was looking into the actions of the ATG, more than 7 decades after it was formed. The writer spoke to retired Army Sergeant First Class Sam Jackson, who, at the time, still resided in the Alaskan village of Kwethluk. Jackson reflected on his time. Jackson can still remember the tense mood of that period when a nightly blackout was imposed across Alaska. That was to try and inhibit any attempted invasion by the enemy. It must have been a strange time to live through. Jackson also recalled the instruction he and his comrades received from the military. "They told us to follow your training, and it will save your life," he said. That's how we trained. The ATG was unusual for its time in more than one way. Not just the vast array of different ethnicities of which it was comprised, but also for its female members, too. Mixed gender units were extremely rare at that time, but the ATG had volunteers who were women. Most served as nurses, but one woman was extremely skilled with a firearm and was consequently given a combat role. In fact, very few females had ever been handed such positions in the army at that time. By modern standards, this period of American history was still profoundly racist and sexist, which makes the fact that the ATG was composed of different ethnicities and included women quite notable. But at the same time, it wasn't completely progressive. To the contrary, there are some grim stories to consider, too. After Dutch Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, for example, the US evacuated the Pribilof Islands of Alaska. The islands were in a strategic position, but these preventative measures meant the enforced relocation of the people who lived there. They were loaded up into crowded transports and resettled in another part of Alaska, where they were forced to make a living in extremely unsafe workplaces like factories and mines. Of the 881 people who were moved, around 100 died. As for the ATG, its members did their duty. As the war progressed and became increasingly centered on Europe and the Pacific region, the force's recruits remained focused on protecting their homeland. And from time to time, They were called upon to make some very serious interventions. As the war neared its end, the Japanese decided to try and inflict harm on America. They sent something like 9,000 incendiary balloon bombs toward the territory, which could have done some real damage. The ATG guards spotted them and ultimately aided in the effort to bring them down. The ATG was very much Alaska's first line of defense. Its recruits played a vital part in protecting their homeland and in the wider war effort in general. Without them, the story of World War II may well have played out differently. The ATG was disbanded in 1947. For no pay and at great risk to themselves, its members had served valiantly. But recognition of that effort, sadly, was itself going to prove something of a struggle. After the war, many veterans of the ATG began to exercise their collective power to help end segregation in Alaska. A campaign was organized, which ultimately culminated with the passing of the first anti-discrimination law in Alaska's history. That was some achievement, and it points to the immense talent and dedication of the people of the ATG. Simultaneously, it also lays bare the level of discrimination those same people had experienced at the hands of the country they had served. Beyond that battle for rights, some ATG members went on to make history in another way. They were part of the movement to make Alaska an official U.S. state, which finally happened at the start of 1959. Before then, it had been classified as an organized incorporated territory of the United States. There was a dedicated committee behind the Alaskan statehood movement, and 3 of the 11 people on it were former ATG members. Again, it goes to demonstrate both the influence and drive of these people. But despite all that, it was many decades before the ATG members were finally properly recognized by the US government. Most would regard it as shameful that it took until 2000 for them to be officially considered veterans. Many of the ATG members had actually died by this stage, meaning they passed away without ever receiving the levels of recognition their service deserved. At least, though, there were some veterans who survived long enough to see their efforts properly acknowledged. Recognition of the ATG took another step forward in 2012. Funds were allocated to allow for the creation of a memorial park where the ATG and its members would be enshrined. It was about time, but better late than never. Recognition and respect is the very least the people of the ATG deserve. They worked bravely to protect both their own land and a country of which they were not yet even a full part. They did their duty. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.